So, a big point of contention in RWBY Volume 5 was the fights. Specifically, how many, or rather how few, there were. Well, since I'm a lunatic and was literally kept up at night thinking about it, I've decided to count the fight scenes that have appeared in every volume so far, just to see if Volume 5 really had the least fights. Now, first of all, you need to know that I've given these fights a point system. My reason for this being that not all fights are the same. Jaune vs. Cardin is technically a fight, but you can't really put it on the same level as, say, Penny vs. Pyrrha. These points are meant to represent the quality of the fights. 20 shitty fights is less desirable than 3 great ones. An average, well-done fight will receive 1 point. This should be the minimum standard the fight should strive for. The lowest score a fight can receive is 1/4 of a point, and the maximum score is 2 points. Factors such as length, animation quality, and choreography play a factor into the score given to each fight. A short but well thought out fight can be just as good, if not better, than a long, boring one. I'll be going through each fight throughout the series, assigning them a point and giving a brief explanation to my reasonings. It should go without saying that this is slightly subjective, however I'm doing my best to look at each fight fairly and logically. My opinions on characters, song used, or other personal biases should not factor into the quality of each fight. With that, let's jump into it. RWBY and Glynda vs. Torchwick. 1. A little slow, but overall a good introduction into the action of the show. Yang vs. Ursa. 1/4. Too much talking for only being 1 minute long. Ren vs. King Taijitu. 1. Fast, if a little confusing, makes it easy to ignore Pyrrha talking in the background. RWBY vs. Deathstalker. 1/4. Tensionless, with every character either not caring or forgetting how to fight properly. RWBY vs. Nevermore and Juniper vs. Deathstalker. 1 3/4. Beautiful choreography and exciting environment. Weiss vs. Boarbatusk. 1/2. Some goofy animation, a sudden dip in fighting ability, and we cut to non-combatants too frequently. Jaune vs. Cardin. 1/4. Weirdly lit, downright bad animation, zero thought put into the choreography, no tension, no interest, no stakes, no reason to care about the outcome. Jaune vs. Ursa. 3/4. Character accurate, lame-o tactics are still dull to watch. Blake and Sun vs. Torchwick, featuring Penny. 2. Fast, dynamic, the most exciting a fight has ever gotten in RWBY. Total score, 9 fights to 7 3/4 points. Volume 1's fights seem to vary a lot in terms of quality. Fights are either pretty lame or mind-blowing, with few being just good. It's also bonkers how big that gap is between the first and second fights of the volume. We waited 5 weeks for the second fight to happen. They became more consistent after that, but it's still crazy to think about now. Food fight, 1 1/4. Goofy situation doesn't detract from the excellent choreography at all. RWBY, Sun, and Neptune vs. Paladin, 1 1/2. Fun use of setting and awesome teamwork. Pyrrha vs. Cardinal, 1. Perfect showcase for Pyrrha that never gets confusing. Pyrrha vs. Mercury, 3/4. Nice animation for the most part, nicely done choreography between 2 frequent lulls to react. Cinder's infiltration featuring RWBY, 3/4. Inconsistent animation that tends to move pretty slow. Ill-fitting music and the interesting setting and character circumstances aren't used at all. RWBY vs. Grimm, 3/4. While I appreciate the attempted variety, the screen splitting disrupts the flow of combat and makes the fight harder to follow. Quickly becomes a just talking scene with the girl shooting at an enemy sometimes. RWBY and Oobleck vs. the Train, 1 3/4. RWBY and Oobleck stuff are pretty stiff, but everyone else's fights are exciting and dynamic enough to distract from how convenient they all are. Special praise for only having the girls talk to each other when there isn't an enemy in front of them. Grimm attack, 3/4. Stiff, boring choreography, with the Grimm just standing around waiting to get hit. Too much time spending looking at new characters joining the fray. Total score, 8 fights at 8 1/2 points. I was a little surprised Volume 2 scored so well. It's been my least favorite volume for years, so I assumed the quality of its fights would sort of represent that. However, I found the fights to be consistently fair to great. I think the problem that I have, though, is that the less impressive fights happen to be also pretty important ones. For example, the final fight gets one of the lowest scores of the volume. It seems they just needed to prioritize different fights, and perhaps I wouldn't have disliked the volume as much as I did. RWBY vs. ABRN, 1. Fun choreography, but too many reaction shots. Juniper vs. Bronze, 1. Slow animation with some dumb tactics used by Bronze. Great camera, though. Sun vs Indigo, 3/4. Characters keep disappearing and switch targets at random, making it hard to follow. Disappointing conclusion. Qrow vs Winter, 1. Almost too fast to the point that it could become confusing. Questionably thought out tactics are animated well and excitingly. Emerald and Mercury vs Coco and Yatsuhashi, 3/4. Fast, smart choreography at the cost of making Coco and Yatsuhashi kinda dumb. Surprising amount of standing around or reacting for being this short. Weiss and Yang vs Flint and Neon, 3/4. Wonky animation on Neon makes her hard to follow. Clever music helps to distract from the lackluster choreography. Yang vs Mercury, 1. Good pacing and nice atmosphere. Disappointingly short though. Villains vs Amber, 3/4. Slow choreography and animation. Tries to cover that up by having Amber twirl her staff around a lot. Camera doesn't know how to chill out or back up. Penny vs Pyrrha and RWBY vs Mercury, 1 1/4. RWBY and Mercury's half is shoehorned in. Penny and Pyrrha's half is exciting and fluid. Everyone vs Nevermore, 1/4. Too many characters that barely get used. Fancy camera work is the only thing making me consider this a real fight. Ironwood vs Beowolf, 1/2. Beowolf is animated well. Ironwood's animation is goofy. Camera makes it impossible to see how effective his gun is half the time. Weiss and Blake vs robots in White Fang, 1/4. Hard to follow and lazy shortcuts. Everyone vs Invasion and Paladins, featuring Velvet, 1. Velvet's reused animation looks nice, but is also pretty dull. RWBY vs Torchwick and Neo, 1. Cameraman needs to stop drinking so much coffee. Too much talking for a life and death situation. Ozpin vs Cinder, 1/2. Great animation, well thought out action, clear display of the high level abilities of the two. It's just a shame the whole thing lasts less than a minute. Pyrrha vs Cinder, 1.5. Some awkward physics, but for the most part, real solid. Lingering on impacts emphasizes the strike, and I wish they did that more. Total score, 16 fights for 14 1/4 points. Something I noticed about this volume's combat is how active the camera became, but not in a good way. The camera shakes so often that action gets hard to follow. It'll also stick itself in weird places, often to the detriment to the flow of the fight. This only occurs in this volume though, so it seems RT learned how to let the viewer actually get to watch the fight. Ranger vs Geist, 3/4. Action stops too frequently, floaty, weightless physics, and mundane tactics. Blake, Sun, and Qrow vs Sea Dragon, 1. Fun use of setting, things have weight and the characters use real strategy. Ranger vs Tyrion, 1/2. Fast-paced, but the conversation interrupts the flow of combat for way too long. No teamwork and characters just seem to disappear if the camera's not on them. Qrow and RWBY vs Tyrion, 1. Quick tempo and well choreographed when they actually just let the fight happen. Too much stopping to talk ruins the fight. Yang vs Tai, 1/4. Choreography feels thought out if slow, laughably short with both bouts of training combined only totaling a minute runtime. Blake and Sun vs Ilya, 1/4. Goofy, slow animation, with everything happening feeling contrived. Ranger vs Knuckleavi, 3/4. Slow pace with the action stopping too frequently. Knuckleavi just seems to give up at the end. Total score, 7 fights at 4.5 points. I'm disappointed Volume 4 did so poorly. I actually kinda liked this volume, so I was surprised to see such a bad score come out of it. Most of its fights were pretty bad, with its biggest problem being that they just keep stopping so characters can talk. Weiss vs Lancers, 3/4. Pretty slow until Armor Guy gets summoned. Yang vs Bandits, 3/4. Quick action and smart choreography. Complete incompetence of the bandits makes the fight too one-sided. RWBY vs Oscar, 1/4. We spend too much time looking at anything other than the action, boring choreography, and weird animation. Belladonna's vs White Fang, 1/4. Next to nothing here, simply a teaser for the fight to come, distracting how apparently the Belladonnas only hire people with no aura. Gira, Sun, and Blake vs White Fang, 1/4. Poorly animated and boring choreography. Belladonnas and Sun vs White Fang, 1. For the most part, too much talking between Blake and Ilya. Sun's gunchucks are awesome, but ultimately aren't enough. Oscar vs Leo, 1/4. Fast and well animated with dumb choreography. Aim for anything other than his shield, numbnuts. Weiss vs Vernal, 1/4. Most of the fight we can't see Vernal, making the encounter tensionless. Weiss' sudden dip in ability isn't fun to watch. Ozpin vs Hazel, featuring Leo and Qrow, 3/4. Nice animation with great weight, weirdly interrupted by jumping to other characters for no reason. Raven vs Cinder, 1. Even though they have so much at their disposal, both characters just use sword. Bigger swords does not make it more exciting. Hard to see background makes it confusing and hard to follow. Total score: 10 fights, 5.5 points. Surprisingly, Volume 5 has the second most fights of the series. However, it also received the second worst score. For both Volume 4 and 5, I never found a fight that got better than 1 point, and I think that's a big factor to why the community was so upset about Volume 5. Volume 4 underperformed, with the least amount of fights for a volume, and received the lowest score. We wanted an improvement with 5, but with half of the fights receiving my lowest score possible of 1/4, we felt cheated. There is also, I believe, another reason we found Volume 5 so disappointing. So, RWBY has the tendency to have all the build-up to a fight just to either cut away from the action or find a reason to stop the fighting before it can really begin. I like to call these not-quite fights. And so, in order to make my point, I'm going to go through all of these not-quites in RWBY so far. So, here we go. Weiss and RWBY not fighting the Beowolves, the attack on Tucson, Penny finishing up with Cardinal, the sword clash between Blake and Adam, Ironwood's still alive reveal and Qrow using his scythe. To be clear, this was just not enough for me to consider it a fight. Weiss's party problems, Lee fighting off the Knuckleavi, Cinder's training, Yang and Weiss not fighting the bandits, not getting to see Emerald fight the bandits, Blake and Sun stomping these guys, Jaune's opening attack on Cinder, Emerald stopping RWBY, establishing Yang vs Mercury, Qrow and Raven clashing swords, establishing Weiss vs Vernal, Ren and Nora charging Hazel, Emerald and RWBY talk while they shoot at each other, Cinder talking to Jaune, Hazel approaching Oscar and Qrow, Yang not fighting Emerald and Mercury, more Yang not fighting Emerald and Mercury, Hazel stomping Qrow, RWBY and Yang vs Emerald and Mercury, more RWBY and Yang vs Emerald and Mercury, Nora making Hazel go down, the kids vs Emerald and Mercury, Sun and Blake twirl their weapons at Adam, Blake joining her friends. So, I just listed 28 instances. 20 of them were in Volume 5, and 17 of them were in the last 4 episodes of the volume. The problem with Volume 5 isn't that we were given few fights, but rather that so many were promised, but never followed up on. We end up spending our time watching the show establish a bunch of fights, rather than actually getting to see any. I hope Rooster Teeth learns from this mistake, that simply implying a bunch of fights will only lead to a disappointed audience. If you have no intention on showing us any of these fights you set up, then don't set them up. It's like getting presented with 20 cakes you get to sample, but only end up being served 2 slices. All the other cakes are on the table, but you have to settle for the portion you got. Don't overload your show with cakes we don't get to have. Here's hoping Volume 6 picks things up a bit. Fights that are frequent enough to keep us excited while also keeping the fights of good quality. Thoughtful choreography, creative use of the cast's abilities, satisfying animation, and hopefully a minimum of these not-quite fights.